I'm Zuber-Skerritt, the producer of this second series of video programs on postgraduate research and supervision. This video series has been produced simply from recordings of a residential staff development program on postgraduate research and supervision held at the Pan Pacific Hotel on the Queensland Gold Coast in September 1993. The aim of this series is to provide supervisors and postgraduate students with resources to understand and improve their postgraduate studies in their department or institution.
Let me turn first to make a few very general comments about the whole rationale for postgraduate studies. I think that the importance of postgraduate education is the key to strengthening academic and professional expertise in Australia. And it's through research education and training, advanced and updated professional education, in-depth specialisation within particular fields, that really our tertiary institutions are going to become better equipped to provide high-quality research, develop links nationally and internationally, but to provide teaching staff to cope with growth in higher education, including higher education itself. I believe the system is poised nationally, as it were, at a turning point. We're at the point of being able to take much better advantage of growth in postgraduate education that is happening in the system, and the case, I think, is now established for quite considerable expansion 1993 onwards and beyond. I want to turn to the concept of research culture. I believe it's an important one. Postgraduate scholarship activity reflects it, as also I think the activity of the academic community in submitting applications for funding. And the probabilities lie in the direction of writing an application for research funding following doing a thesis. But yet writing a thesis and a research application reflect the concept of a research culture at work and in similar ways. And I think a key term and concept for understanding that is the overarching rationale of quality. Let me turn to the meaning of research culture. First of all, I went into the literature, and there's no consensus about the definition of culture. But let me give you one I think begins to prepare us for what research culture might be. Hofstede in 1990 defined a culture as a system of shared values that produces normative pressures on members of an organisation. But I think one of the clearest descriptions of culture that prepares the way was by Edgar Schein in a classical article in the American Psychologist in 1990, and I quote, "Culture is what a group learns over a period of time as that group solves its problems of survival in an external environment and its problems of internal integration." The problem is that academics pose a peculiar definition of culture. The culture of an academic group is much more complex than that of other institutions. It draws on cultural inputs from the subscribing academic professions, a whole range of different academic disciplines, and the very nature of the specific enterprise. But a research culture is a concept we all intuitively know perhaps what it is, but hardly ever is its salience features defined. I want to return to a classic article in a not too well-known source, the Administrative Science Quarterly by Pettigrew in 1979, who extended the anthropological concept of research culture to a particular context of everyday working groups. He proposed that the need for people to function effectively together within a given social setting gives rise to a particular group culture. And he described that concept of organisational culture as, quote, "a system of publicly and collectively accepted meanings operating for a given group at a given time." The factors affecting research cultures, I think, have been most ably summarised by a recent article by Bland and Ruffin in an article they titled Characteristics of a Productive Research Environment. The factors affecting research cultures do not operate in research groups as isolated characteristics. Importantly, they liken the factors to fine threads of a whole fabric. Individual, yet while interwoven, provide a strong, supportive and stimulating backdrop for the researcher. They make the point that, quote, while at a distance the productive enterprise looks like a highly robust entity, upon closer inspection it is revealed to be a delicate structure, highly dependent on existence and effective working of numerous individual, organisational and leadership characteristics. Let me put up what they defined as the characteristics of a research culture. They stipulated 12 characteristics. Clear goals must exist that serve a coordinating function. A research culture must have an emphasis on research, and it must be distinctive, and I want to return to that. It must be a positive group climate. It must assert its governance in a participative way, and it must organise itself in a decentralised way, and there must be frequent communication. Resources must be accessible. There must be respect for size, age and diversity, and there must be rewards built in. There must be a concentration on recruitment and selection, and finally, there must be leadership. While it is clear that the leader has a disproportionate influence, it cannot be underestimated that those 12 factors are overarchingly interdependent. I want now to look at the concept of quality. The overarching rationale that sustains, in my view, a research culture must necessarily appeal to the concept of quality. Is one of those terms that has a meaning we all understand, but there's no one among us who would not find it difficult to define. I went to the Random House Dictionary, which bravely attempted to define it as a characteristic, property or attribute that denotes a high grade, great excellence, accomplishment or attainment. Let me link the concept of quality to a research culture illustrated by a thesis and a research application. And you may disagree with the emphasis I choose to place on peer review. The concept of quality has several specific meanings, but they all relate meaningfully, I believe, to the process of peer review. That process is relevant ultimately to a thesis, submission and acceptance and award of a degree, and to a research application for funding. Let me spell out some of the features of that. First, the term quality denotes for me research that stands out as meritorious in a large pool of work. That meaning is important because it refers to the normative framework within which similar work will be assessed. That frame of reference defines, in part, the statistical probability that the application will be supported or the degree awarded. Second, a quality product is of such a kind that peers will judge that it does have merit. The ultimate yardstick of excellence is the successful application of the process of peer review. Peer review is flawed, and there's a wonderful quote around it's crooked, but it's the only game in town. Ultimately impressionistic, affected by many factors, but who among us can argue a better system, a better scheme to take its place? Third, the judgment of the excellence of research in a thesis or application for funding must surely be such that there's a reasonable consensus about quality. Peers, in the one case examiners, in the other case one's colleagues and experts in the field may disagree, but a meritorious proposal for funding or thesis for a degree ought to reach agreement across judges. And in an ideal world, judge merit should be reliably evident. Fourth, the merit of good work should be evident both with respect to the quality of the research itself and the quality of how the proposal to conduct the work or the thesis is communicated to others. Failure to get a degree or to be supported will result from a deficiency in either. The degree won't be awarded or the grant given. In the context of those remarks, let me define now what I mean by meritorious research. I think the definition fits a variety of research procedures and both a thesis and a research application. A meritorious research project is well defined, investigates a significant problem or major issue in theory or practice, or is a program of work aiming towards the development of new knowledge, fundamental or applied. And my final sentence, its worth should be evident to others and earn the respect of one's peers. In both a thesis and a research application, the nature of the research must be obvious and communicated clearly. The research should be well defined both in terms of the adequacy of the design and methodology that underlies it and the ease with which the arguments can be understood by others, one's peers. But in writing an application for funding or writing a thesis, one must be aware, and so many aren't, of the first and foremost principle that responsibility rests with the person writing to communicate the work properly and well. The situation is analogous, surely, with the process of editorial review of work submitted for publication. There is a person or persons sitting in judgment who must be convinced of the quality or merit of the work, and peer assessment is used as the instrument to collect evidence of quality. The process of evaluation may at times be flawed, but we expect it to be consistent, and finally, one hopes such consistency will be evident. Let me turn now to look at evaluation of the quality of a thesis in particular. In doing so, I'll hazard a definition of what I regard as a good thesis and draw out what I think are the major principles at stake, all flowing, I believe, from the presence of a research culture vigorously operating. And along the way, I'll also formulate guidelines for assessment. Now, the examiner's report at the University of Queensland, and I think it could just as easily be an examiner's report of any of the institutions here at this conference, asks examiners in making their report to assess the quality of a thesis. We're supposed to draw attention to the candidate's demonstration of originality, critical insight, capacity to conduct independent research, contribution of knowledge, and suitability for publication. Now, I start to get into the realm of personal assertion, and I'd be glad to take up any of these in questions afterwards. But students should first and foremost understand that a thesis is not a publication. I would define a thesis as a testimonial in scientific report writing of the progression of thinking towards the solution of a problem. A testimonial in report writing of a progression of thinking towards the solution of a problem. The moment I define it that way, I'll supervise differently. Different types of theses, coursework, PhD, can help illustrate the point. I don't believe a master's coursework thesis has to solve a problem or even make a substantial contribution in the same way as a PhD. A coursework thesis typically investigates an issue of some practical or professional relevance and shows the careful application of scientific reasoning. A PhD, on the other hand, has to make a substantial contribution to the area of a discipline in which the thesis is written and be publishable, but not published in principle, as a series of studies. Let me comment on each of these issues, and they immediately take a stand on style of supervision. Quality versus quantity. So many times students start thinking that the amount of work will impress. Examiners will approve the work if there's a lot of it. It's quality of scholarship that's always primary, given the remaining criteria are met. Secondly, and not everyone would share this, I believe, is succinctness. A thesis must demonstrate, to my mind, a logical development of an argument threading through the program of work. A useful strategy to adopt to emphasize that progression is to separate essential material from less essential material by including the latter in appendices to the thesis. One should think very carefully about the introduction to a thesis. The introduction should put the problem into context, show the grasp of literature, but should not be written to establish how much the student knows about the discipline as a whole. It's wise also to think carefully, I think, about how theory should be used. How many students we know are ever in the position of proving a major theory? Few theses can reasonably be expected to decide conclusively one way or another on any theory. Theory, and here I get into philosophy of science, to my mind, and it's a view I spread to my students, or try to, helps organize the data which the studies thread through. And when writing a thesis, it's most useful to view a theory not as something to be proved, but as a useful way of organizing the data around a logical, coherent viewpoint. A third point is format. Format should be absolutely perfect. All research can be criticized methodologically. There is always much to criticize about any piece of work, no matter how good it is. But don't let the criticisms have anything to do with format. A model of clarity and exposition sets the stage for an uncritical examiner. If the research can't be perfect, at least the format can. Guidelines for assessment, I think one of the most important things is a critical tone. And here I draw on my experience not only in supervising, but in marking theses. A thesis should primarily demonstrate evidence of what I'd call analytical ability. Whatever the area of the thesis, whatever its topic or its approach, there must be evidence that the student appreciates the possible limitations of what they've done. The two most important facets of this ability to me are, one, constructive criticism of others and criticism of oneself as well as others, using precisely the same standards of evaluation. And two, application of sound principles of logic demonstrated in the flow, relentless, and consistency, relentless of the thesis. And that guideline of a critical tone is independent of the level of the thesis, honours, masters, or PhD. Methodology. There should be no major methodological pitfalls or errors of logic in the argument. And notice my shift away from not saying the methodology is not flawed, but I'm saying let there be no errors in the logic of the argument. Assumptions behind methodologies are often problematic, but they should always be discussed and recognized even when they're not sustained. For example, is a study really a replication or is it not? So often students, and I turn to the next category, errors in statistics, and here I shade over into more some of the empirical theses, so often errors in statistics demonstrate a profound area of anxiety to students. There are whole lots of errors that they could fall into. But what happens often is students engage in the pyrotechnics of statistical display, the statistical overkill to prove they're error-free, produces an impression at times of an immature and untrained mind. Objectives. Content should always be considered in relation to the major objectives of a thesis. They should be listed at the outset, and the thesis written relentlessly so that the text is perfectly consistent with them. And lastly, impartiality. All personal references should be avoided, but also the student should always be careful to present alternative viewpoints to a theory that he or she prefers, so that at least the assessor knows, the peer, the judge, that other options were considered. Finally, in relation to style, the best theses, to my mind, are those that are written in such a way so as to enthuse the reader about the work being done and the candidate's commitment to research. Rewriting again and again is necessary to achieve that goal and requires intensive communication, liaison, and help with the supervisor. After all that, let me define a good thesis. A sound thesis should provide a critical analysis of a topic, be critical of the author as much as of others, and always point to further work that needs to be done. It should bear on a particular problem that doesn't yield too excessive a number of hypotheses, in a focused way, should be written succinctly and in a flawless format. It should use theory cautiously, not recklessly, and its design should always tally with the objectives as stated in the text and at the outset of the work. The program of work should flow logically and relentlessly in the text of the thesis, with the main text reserved for the major parts of the developing argument. A good thesis must have a position, and that must be stated clearly, and that position must always be argued in a way that is fair to others in the literature, who might think differently about the phenomenon with which the thesis is concerned. Let me turn now to evaluating a research application, and I won't spend nearly as much time on it, rather do I emphasize the common concerns that thread through writing a thesis and evaluating a research application. To me, the process of writing an application for funding bears important similarities to writing a thesis. And I want to make that point by listing 16 common concerns which I've drawn from evaluating hundreds of research applications associated with the Australia Research Council. Some of them are necessarily peculiar to funding, for example, defending the budget, commencing the work. But one can't but be impressed by the remarkable commonality. The first of the common concerns, and all of these reflect issues which, if they're not met by the funding application, raise a serious chance of it not being supported. Notice that the first one is the commitment to the topic. And let me draw in number 2, communication of the liveliness and enthusiasm for the work. A good thesis and a good application must demonstrate that commitment and show enthusiasm for the work being done. And if that is evident, many other deficiencies can be overlooked, put into perspective, or viewed differently. Work that's reported that sounds as if the person finds it boring and uninteresting is headed on the way to failure. Next is the precision or definition of the project. Define a research proposal, project, very carefully in terms of its objectives and state it precisely. When you do discuss your proposal, and it's equally relevant to a thesis, produce evidence of academic content and communicate your scholarship. Avoid impressionistic observations and avoid subjective comment. And so frequently, students will drift in and investigators will drift into their proposals, into comments like, it should be intuitively obvious that this is a highly significant piece of work. Use argument, not prescription. And if there's any relevant data around that bears similarity in content, for heaven's sake, use it. One of the major criticisms of funding proposals, and these are all relevant to funding proposals, I'm trying to stress their commonality to thesis. One of the major problems from examiners and from peers who assess funding proposals is, I don't know enough about the work. But there's a fine line in the guidance of supervision between a student saying too much and too little. And perhaps that's the difference at times between a 400-page magnum opus and a 280-page thesis beautifully expressed. Demonstrate familiarity and experience with the relevant processes and techniques associated with the work. And 10, I think, is relevant to funding proposals. Adequate justification of budget. Let me lay that aside and move to the next one. And here, perhaps I stress something a little controversial. As a supervisor, I would always want to make the distinction between a quality product and a political task. A thesis is a task done for a certain purpose, and I would wish to steer students away from certain areas because they're not the kinds of areas that are likely to get them the degree, even though they might be terribly important areas to do high quality research in. 11 says, be aware of the normative frame of reference relating to the funding scheme. And I equally make the point, be aware of the normative frame of reference about what a thesis is all about. You have to take a topic, research it, write it up within a given time frame, show you've done a reasonable amount of work, progress it through various stages, reach a significant outcome and make a contribution to knowledge and do it well. It's not an easy task. And I think the whole appreciation of what that means is a critical part for the supervisor to communicate. 12 is professional presentation. Professionalism screams out at you from something well written. A thesis that's highly professional impresses. So also does a funding proposal. 13, organise where you're going, that relentless logic of argument and consistency, with road signs to remind the reader in case their attention has flagged. Reinforce by direct and concise language. And I think 14, 15 and 16 are really concerned more with funding agency specific issues. Let me, towards the end, draw on an article I found in the literature, Marsden in 1983. And Marsden is talking about the standards and assessment criteria for dissertations and theses. He is not at all concerned with funding applications. And I want you to look at the commonality between what this list says and what I've just showed you. A master by research must show evidence of original investigation, competence in independent work, an understanding of appropriate techniques, ability to make critical use of published work and source materials, appreciate the relationship of the theme to the wider field of knowledge, in part of publication worthy, PhD original and distinct contribution to knowledge. I could make all of those points and incorporate them under the concerns for evaluating quality in research applications. Let me conclude. I began this talk by listing the characteristics of a research culture, and let me recap on those in the light of what I've shown you. It requires an emphasis on research. The culture is distinctive, it's positive, and it's participative. It benefits most from decentralization and frequent communication. It requires accessible resources and should recognize and sustain diversity. Above all, the concept of quality permeates it, and there's an overarching interdependency of all its factors. I leave to last the question of what structures are needed to foster a research culture in the university, and I'm sure that others will take up that issue later in more detail than I will. But let me conclude by offering, consistent with the characteristics of a research culture that I've listed above, one kind of structure, not the only one, that does operate at a decentralized level and in a participative way, which can actively foster a research culture. I'm emphasizing action to encourage research at the grassroots levels in departments. My role as Pro-Vice-Chancellor at the University of Queensland, and it's a role others may execute quite differently, is to facilitate the encouragement of a research culture in the community. And when a member of staff comes and tells me that they have achieved something that I may have helped contribute to, I do not want him to tell me that I contributed to it, because the culture is not working properly unless they take ownership and identify with it. Every department should have a research committee, and I reach out the same kinds of principles to a postgraduate education committee. Groups should encourage the formation of these committees, if there are faculties or groups in the university, and monitor them at departmental level. Produce some system of checks and balances. And where I think centralized bureaucracy and structures can operate is to probe, prod, produce checks and balances so that the initiative of the grassroots is never lost. Effort should be made in departments by their research committees to identify projects and encourage staff to apply for support for them. Committees should operate at departmental level to review applications and even to conduct interviews of people going to a funding agency. Particular attention should be there to encourage young and new members of staff. Strong and active researchers should not be too heavily loaded with teaching and administrative responsibilities, and that's a very difficult one, because perhaps it is asking a good departmental head to start to differentiate on the competencies of staff as to who teaches well and who researches well. There should be research committees monitoring what happens in external agency funding rounds, and there are certain groups that need particular attention. I think women need particular attention, as well as the specific needs of different disciplines, because women often, in my opinion, are forced into excessive nurturant roles, while other people do the research and other people get rewarded for it. The overall aim is to encourage the research culture of a university and to implement guidelines to foster research activities at the departmental level. And that really reaches out to incorporate a number of things: applying for research grants, facilitating research in the department, and encouraging and facilitating postgraduate research, and helping people write and submit work for them. I'd like to conclude now by just drawing on again the importance of a research culture being active, alive, and positively embedded within an institution. The point was made this morning that research must be valued. You can't have a research culture without research being without it being valued for its own sake. There must be resources flowing to it. There are a lot of things that are important in the academic community. Research is just one of them. Teaching is another. Proper management is another. And somehow the nexus has to come together and work. But I believe that if a research culture is operating properly, it reaches out to infuse an appreciation of standards in postgraduate education and in other important activities such as attracting external funds to do one's own research. They are both manifestations of this culture operating well and vigorously, and the culture can't be sustained unless quality defines it.